Now, is Craig the Obamacare lawyer billing us by the quarter hour as he holds on?
All right, that's enough of that. Craig, the Obamacare lawyer, so grateful.
Y'all have sapped my WTL.
Really?
I'm sorry that I really am sorry that you got involved in this at all, because there is some pretty interesting Obamacare stuff going on.
I'm just kidding you. Yeah, there is. I've completely forgotten what it was, though. I don't even.
Well, is it true or not, though, just this part, that they added 1,200 pages in the dark of the night on 4th of July weekend?
They did.
Wow.
They added,
that's all you need to know, really.
Yeah. Well, and it was actually, I think, 4 pages shy of 1,300 pages, but who's quibbling?
Yeah.
And I did skim most of it. I read it, and like Joe, I think Joe read on the air yesterday. It was really, really detailed minutia on how doctors are going to be reimbursed from the government. The upshoot of it is, healthcare costs are going up anywhere from 7 to 13% nationwide, and that's the lower estimates. Government doctors are going to be reimbursed through Medicare and Medicaid about 2.1% more. So, you could say, well, they're getting more money, but in reality, they're not even keeping up a little bit with inflation. So that means less of those doctors wanting to see Medicare and Medicaid patients, and that means less supply for all of us ultimately.
I know that's my parents' real worry, is that they live in a small town in Arizona with an old doctor who may retire, and he might just decide, F it, I don't make enough money, and then who's gonna want to get into that line of work because it doesn't pay that well.
Well, and on a micro level, if your parents are worried about their one doctor, that's a real concern. I mean, what I generally tell my parents, who are in the same age bracket, is that you guys are going to be fine. At the age you're at, you're going to be fine. It's the age we're at that I'm a little bit more worried about.
Yeah, well, long term, certainly, yeah.
All right, yeah. Well, let's spend 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we really need to take a break. But I know your headline has to do with, well, I asserted earlier that Obamacare is making a huge contribution to part-time America, low labor participation rate, unemployment numbers that are not nearly as good as they may seem. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's and I tried to document it through a few different sources. I mean, Investors Business Daily's done a great job of documenting every single public statement that's been made by any public entity, like a school district or a private employer. And they added 28 employers in June alone that said, we are cutting back hours due to Obamacare. So that list is now up to 429 employers. And I think the best piece of that story is the government itself, months and months ago, said, well, the best way to really determine if Obamacare is going to be changing the workforce would be to look at the percentage of workers working just over 30 hours a week compared to the percentage of workers working just under 30 hours a week. And the punchline there is that ratio is plunged to the lowest in 14 years, meaning we are seeing a shift from those people working 31 to 35 hours to working 25 to 30 hours. And again, the reason that's relevant is because if you're under 30 hours a week, you're a part-time employee under Obamacare, and the employer does not have to buy you health care.
So there are disincentives to letting people work more hours or working them more hours and thereby paying them more money. Let's talk more about employment when we come back in just a moment or two. I know there are some new analyses of how Obamacare is going to affect employment, et cetera. So stay tuned. Not to mention how it's going to hit you in the pocketbook.
It's a pretty simple calculation if you run a business and you think, well, I can just get everybody under 35 hours or whatever I've got to get them under.
Right.
And save a gazillion dollars.
I used to give them full-time hours or nearly full-time hours and happily pay for their insurance. It's become too expensive. Now they're a part-timer.
Right.
How's your utopia come along?
It's pretty simple. You're listening to the Armstrong and Getty Show. Two very quick texts on the Armstrong and Getty Show. Your show has policies. Yeah, it's kind of doesn't sound like it. And fire them all, then hire them back at lower pay.
Really? Thanks for your input, everybody.
Welcome to the show. Glad you're here.
So, Craig Gottwals is one of the leading experts on Obamacare and what it means to companies in America, and we rudely kept him waiting while we discussed show policy. And yes, we have policies, but he is so gracious. He has hung around. Craig, our heartfelt apologies, sir.
Oh, not a problem, gentlemen.
So, the employers are keeping employees under 30 hours. We've documented that. It's undeniable. Some recently unleashed analyses of Obamacare's effect. What have they told us?
Yeah, Casey Mulligan's an econ professor at the University of Chicago, and he also happens to be a columnist for the New York Times. I mean, he's clearly not a right-wing lunatic. And so what we had back in March, if you'll recall that far back, was the CBO put out a report that said, look, we think that once Obamacare is fully implemented between 2016 and 2018, you're going to see 1.5% fewer Americans working. So again, you're looking at that 62.8% of adults that are actually working in the workforce. They're saying, well, that's going to go down by 1.5%. Well, Casey Mulligan has just put out a working paper that says, no, that's not quite right. He's looking at double that amount. He's saying 3% of America will be working less by 2016 due to Obamacare, and that's from that famous line that Nancy Pelosi said, which was, look, it's just because people are going to choose to work less because they're going to have a safety net, and they could be, artists or painters or musicians.
Things that don't produce anything for the economy.
Yeah, and that ties into our jobs report last month because while it was generally a decent to good jobs report, what was not reported was full-time jobs actually went down by 523,000. Part-time jobs increased by 840,000.
Wow, nobody reported that.
Yeah, I did see that on Fox last week. Damn near 1 million increase in part-time jobs, and is that mostly about employers trying to get them under that 35 hours?
Well, you can't prove that, but there's so much anecdotal evidence to that effect now that we are getting this recovery, but everybody's pushing people under 30 hours to make sure that, look, if I'm going to hire somebody new and it's a job that can be supported by a 29-hour worker, then why force myself to buy them health care in the uncertainty of this employer mandate?
Your job is not to judge the media so much, but I mean, it is astounding that jobs report that came out. That should be the headline. To me, that's the most the striking thing about that whole report is how many more people now are working part-time than were before. That was the biggest number in the whole thing.
I mean, the headline to me was 500,000 full-time jobs lost by the economy.
Right.
And nobody said that. I mean, it was 500,000 lost. Yes, we had a net increase of 300,000, but those were part-time jobs.
By the way, it's probably worth pointing out for folks who don't know Craig, he is not an ideologue, a commentator. He's someone who makes his living at helping companies understand what the reality of this is so they can plan. And if he's wrong and is sporting some sort of anti-Obama nonsense because he doesn't like black people, for instance, that he would quickly lose his practice and lose his job. Craig makes his living on being accurate and figuring out what this stuff really means, and that's why we like having him on the show.
That's an excellent point.
True or false? We've discussed the disincentive for employers giving people full-time work or nearly full-time work. There are going to be disincentives for individuals to get promoted or do more work because they might lose their subsidies or bring on fines or that sort of thing.
Right, yeah, it gets a little complicated, but the easiest thing to remember is, like we've talked about, there's 2 speed bumps to hiring, and those 2 speed bumps are 30 hours a week. An employer wants to keep you below 30 hours a week, and then an employer doesn't want to grow past 50 employees if they can, because if you're under 50 employees, the law doesn't even apply to you in many respects. But what also happens is, if an employer does take you over 30 hours a week, and that employer offers health care, and let's say you happen to have been a person that was working 25 hours a week, you were getting government subsidies. Once you go over 30 hours a week, let's say your employer wants to take you from 26 to 31 hours, which is not a whole lot of pay, you'll lose your government subsidies because now you have employer-sponsored health care. So it's very likely that in that case you could see a net decrease to your income as a family.
If you're married with kids, absolutely.
Well, welcome to the dependency ghetto where self-improvement costs you. It doesn't benefit you, it costs you, which is the insidious part of socialism, and it's been observed every time it's tried, but we choose to ignore it, at least for now.
In that particular report, Joe, from Casey Mulligan, he actually quantified that number as being roughly 4 million Americans will be in that boat, where if they go just over 30 hours a week, they'll take a pay decrease, so there will be no incentive for them to do so.
You'd have to you'd almost have to switch either careers or to a different company to where you're going to make a huge leap in your income to want to do that.
And you'd have to, or you could go from say 20 to 40 hours.
Right.
That's a big enough change that it would overcome the problem. Yeah.
What's happening with employer-provided health care? Plans,
and this one surprises me a bit because I really personally did think we would, and in my client base, for example, I'm not seeing hardly any decrease in the provision of benefits. But the CBO had estimated that in this first year of Obamacare, we would see 500,000 people move from employer plans to government plans, and that equates to 0.33%. It's a pretty small number, pretty modest projection. Well, we've got the final numbers in, and it's not a final number, but the projection we're seeing now is that drop was actually 2%. Or 3 million people, which is 6-7 times greater than they had projected.
This time, what about the next time around?
That's just this year. This year that had all these problems, right? I mean, that's going to at least double next year in most projections.
Hey, and then a general question, answer it any way you want, but all the various tough parts of Obamacare, the mandates and the musts and the fines if you don't, et cetera, that were put off till after various elections. Where do we stand on all that stuff?
Yeah, well, the individual mandate we've talked about on this show a number of times is it's legally still in the law, but it's effectively dead. There's over 20 exemptions to it now, and we're at 1.6% of Americans that'll ever actually pay that penalty. So it's really non-existent. The employer mandate, which we've talked about also for roughly a year, is that's what we're talking about here. That's these hours restrictions and whatnot, and I think that's going to survive on paper. Probably until, again, I really think they're going to amend it again or delay it prior to the November elections, because that's the vehicle where you're seeing part-time nation. That's the law that says 30 and 50, and so 30 hours and 50 employees. And so I really believe they're still going to amend that, because one of the blurbs I sent you, Joe, was Politico, again, hardly a right-wing leaning publication, came out and said, with an article headline yesterday, and the headline alone was, "Why Liberals Are Now Abandoning the Obamacare Employer Mandate." And so I think once you get liberals on board with what conservatives have been railing against it all along, I just think that employer mandate's dead, and that's the one that was first delayed last July and then delayed again this February. It kicks in for most businesses this coming January, and I really do think it will be either delayed again or amended or repealed or something. I mean, some sort of illegal governmental
Well, if it goes away, then what is Obamacare? If the mandate goes away, that was what built the whole thing.
Yeah, if it goes away, Obamacare changes dramatically, and it really just becomes an insurance reform. What Obamacare becomes at that point is just another big bureaucratic law that tells businesses and insurance companies what they must and must not have baked into their insurance plans.
With a large income redistribution aspect.
Yeah, because the whole paying for it thing has disappeared.
And the exchanges will continue to exist somehow, because you're going to have anywhere from 3 to 10 million people in those exchanges. So you're still going to have exactly these taxes and things that support it. Now, the other thing that's just never reported is there was 20-some-odd different taxes that go in to pay for Obamacare. And two of the big ones, right, the employer mandate and the individual mandate, will have been gutted. So you'll have then a need for more revenue, which it won't be a problem, because the administration has come out in the last few months with various statements saying, look, if we come up short in this, that, or the other bucket of monies that we anticipated, we do have the right to increase taxes elsewhere to ensure that you all are covering the cost of Obamacare. One of the costs that we're all paying that nobody talks about or knows is there's roughly a 3 to 3.5% tax on every single insurance plan out there that we're all already paying that goes to cover the cost of these programs.
And the final punchline, because we're out of time, is that of the alleged 30, 35 million people, however many, without insurance, a tiny, tiny percentage of them now has insurance. After all this disruption, all this cost, all these F-ups, et cetera.
Yeah, it's really 3.2, 3.3 million right now.
Yeah. In the whole country. Wow, that's amazing.
Lovely. Beautiful. How's your utopia coming along? Craig Gottwals, if you need to get in touch with Craig for your company's planning, et cetera, we've got a link to his information at ArmstrongandGettyRadio.com. Craig, always good to talk to you, man.
Thanks, guys.
All right. No, thank you.